Now, I make no bones about my belief the COVID inquiry is a whitewash and that nothing meaningful will come of it. So much happened in the years from 2020 onwards, so much that it's easy to forget the sequence of events. Now, my first guest this evening has written a book that forensically lays out what happened. Molly Kingsley, co-founder of Us For Them, which is a team of grassroots campaigners that came together in 2020 to stand up for children. Also joining us this evening down the line is GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. But first of all, Molly, what did you learn by writing this book?
It was funny because on one level we learnt nothing that we didn't know already, that this was a pandemic response that, lacked at times all ethical guardrails, that was reckless. I think that's probably a kind word, that, thought nothing about weaponising fear and suppressing dissent. But then on another level, they say the devil is in the detail, and some of the details that we came across, I think, were really shocking to see in black and white, actually, the deficits of governance, of accountability, of ethics, was shocking. And there's a lot in it that actually, I've been relatively on the front line of it for 3 years now, and there's a lot of detail there that I didn't know. So the opportunity to bring that to a wider audience is something I feel quite excited about.
I think, as you almost said there, the book is the accountability deficit, which is, there's a picture of the cover there. I was most affected. I haven't been able to read it word for word, but I've had a good look through it, and I think I've got the sense of it. What amazed me was seeing forensically the timeline. For instance, I could not have testified that the JCVI had already put it on record that they acknowledged that the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis was severe and real. That went out there, that was known to the decision makers before.
And I think this is exactly it. In terms of what we learned, I think we learned that, from the outside, we knew these decisions were terrible. We knew they were harmful. What we didn't know is that actually often the people making the decisions either had thought that themselves previously or had been warned. And it's not just about the vaccine. The book spans different areas, not just kids. But actually it was the extent to which decision makers seem to have disregarded their own beliefs as the pandemic wore on was really appalling.
Joining us down the line, as I say, political commentator Nigel Nelson. Are you there, Nigel? Good evening, Nigel. Thanks for joining us. What do you make of that assertion that there was fundamentally an accountability deficit? Would you accept that as a description of what we just saw happen between 2020 and now?
I think there couldn't be any accountability at the time because we're in the middle of a national emergency. So that was problematic. I'm certainly not denying that mistakes were made. I think we had a pretty lousy government in charge at the time anyway. Certainly when they were charging people into hospital care homes untested, the travel restrictions were probably useless, masks were questionable, eat out to help out, just help the virus. So yes, mistakes were made.
But decisions were taken to put out into billions of arms around the world products about which serious concerns had been raised. Now, surely it's beyond the accountability that's required for those who knowingly took those decisions. It is surely of the utmost seriousness, up there with malfeasance and malpractice, if not malice aforethought.
Well, in a sense, that's what the COVID inquiry will actually establish. I think when it comes to the vaccines, that we have to recognise that we had 150 million jabs given out in this country. According to official figures, they may be disputed, but according to official figures, we're talking about around 50 deaths as a direct result of vaccines. Now, that's less than the smallpox vaccine. Now, when it comes to
Molly, 50 deaths? What do you make? Sorry, Nigel. Molly, what do you make of that? That again, minimising the consequences.
I think there are really serious issues with the tracking of the data for this jab. I don't think that's a secret at this point. I think the MHRA has acknowledged that itself. I think the adverse events, there is a suspicion, are severely underreported. We know autopsies aren't being done. We know at least with one of the vaccines there are serious problems. We know that the JCVI recognised the risk risk of myocarditis, particularly on young men, was real and significant. So I think to minimise that risk at this point does a huge disservice.
And Tonya, another statistic that sticks in my head is that for every that there was a serious adverse event for every 800 doses administered.
Yes.
Now that flies in the face of any suggestion that it could only come down to 50.
No,
50
but also
problems.
let's just crunch it back to the basics. You're jabbing people with chemicals that they don't need. They don't need. This is the thing to go back. You can talk about death, this, whatever. They did not need them. Children did not need them. Young men didn't need them. Young women didn't need them. Jury's out whether you needed it, whether you were over 80 or not. The reality is that we were inflicted and mandated, and it hadn't have been for people like the Together Declaration, we wouldn't have an NHS staff because of this.
Molly, what conclusions did you draw as a result of going back through the sequence of events?
So I don't think mistakes were made. I mean, obviously mistakes were made, but that isn't my conclusion reading this. I think our conclusion was that actually the deficits in decision-making go beyond anything that I would consider reasonable for a society that aspires to call itself a democracy. I don't think you can call yourself a democracy when you are censoring critics of your policy, when you are weaponising fear, when you are using unethical and coercive tactics to force an irreversible intervention on people that never needed it in the first place. This isn't what a democracy does. So I think my ultimate conclusion is, I think if we want to say we live in a democracy, we actually have to confront this reality. It wasn't that mistakes were made. We're talking of a different order of harm and bad decision making here.
Nigel Nelson, what do you make of that? Beyond mistakes.
Well, the whole thing was, I go back to the fact we were facing a national emergency. So you can't expect the democratic process to operate in a normal way in that situation. People overwhelmingly complied with the restrictions because basically they could see they made sense. When it came to lockdown,
national emergency, it wasn't a primo facie national emergency. I would contend that it was made into a national emergency, that there was such a deliberate attempt via propaganda, via the psyops and the nudging and all of the rest of it, to persuade people that there was something there to be feared, which in all honesty was not as it was being described, and that was malicious behaviour on the part of those in a position to make decisions about our lives.
Well, 230,000 people died from COVID.
No, I can't let that figure slide, Nigel.
Let me just finish. And 7 in 10 of those, that was the death certificates, I appreciate, but 7 in 10 of those, COVID was the underlying cause, therefore the main cause. The idea that this was no big deal, I think, is just ridiculous. You were talking about 1 in 10 people who caught COVID worldwide ended up dying from it. The kind of position that the government was facing when it first started was they were actually talking about how they would get mass graves together. They were talking about how to use ice rinks as morgues. Those things did not happen, but it doesn't mean there wasn't a real danger at the time.
Well, I say it was a confected emergency. It was portrayed as an emergency that it need not have been.
So, look, I think whatever you think of what COVID was or wasn't, ministers are still bound by core principles of public life. So we have the Nolan principles, duties to act with integrity, duties to be honest, to make decisions only on the basis of the best evidence. And you can make an argument to say it was an emergency, and during that emergency, the normal parliamentary safeguards were suspended. I don't think you can make an argument to say it was okay for key decision makers to show such disdain for the principles they'd signed up to public life. And whatever and however bad COVID was, that is what they did. So for me, I don't think you even have to get into an argument. And, I, like you, Neil, I think the death figures from COVID have been inflated. I don't understand why we think that's okay and to understate it on the vaccine harm side. But I don't think you have to get into that to show that these were people that appeared to act without integrity throughout the pandemic.
We're going to pick this up again on the other side of another break. Welcome back. My next guest is a former head teacher from Sussex. Mike Fairclough had been outspoken about freedom of speech, and perhaps more controversially, he questioned a lot of what was going on in relation to children, in relation to COVID. He resigned from West Rise School in Langley in September, alleging discrimination, harassment and bullying by East Sussex Council. Mike joins me now. Thanks for joining us. I was aware of you. You had been drawn immediate attention, let's say, for your approach to teaching. That would be fair to say, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So I've been qualified teacher for 30 years and the last 20 years as the head teacher of West Rise Junior School. And when I started at the school, there were 179 kids. It grew to 365 children. 30 members of staff became 60 members of staff, but there was very kind of like low aspiration within the school because it was on like it's on a council estate, and some of the sort of some of the teachers at the time had a kind of sense of I feel a sort of sense of superiority and low expectations of the children. Those people moved on. And then within about a year, started to do some quite innovative stuff. And we discovered that there was an area of farmland opposite the school site, 120 acres of marshland, which was up for lease. So it was like, the farmers were using it for like cattle, etc. And the local authority was looking for somebody to take it over. So I approached them and said, could I use this as part of my school? Because it was also, and you'll like this, it's also on the site of the second largest Bronze Age settlement in Europe, right? So phenomenal thing with like some of the artefacts which are there are in the British Museum. It's that significant.
So fair to say, I would say that you sound like the sort of head teacher that you were opening horizons, literally broadening horizons, and that you have a holistic approach, that you were concerned about the children in every conceivable pastoral sense. So how and why did trouble start for you?
Right. So just to finish off on that first bit. So just to say, it's like the school and I gained some notoriety because we started doing lots of outdoor learning. And the first school to really kind of like really push the whole forest school stuff. I taught my kids to shoot 410 shotguns and air rifles, pluck pigeons, skin rabbits, that kind of thing. We got a herd of water buffalo for the children to look after. And, throughout all of that time, whether it was Ofsted or the Health and Safety Executive or members of Parliament or the media, apart from so back in 2013, the Mail ran a bit of a negative piece about me. There was like this, redneck head teacher gives kids guns and stuff. But what happened was the public came out in complete support of what we were doing, because they're saying that's what kids need to be doing. They need to be outside, building resilience, etc., etc., etc. And even when our herd of water buffalo would escape, which happened regularly, and they even ended up down at Eastbourne seafront, nobody was worried about it at all. But it was when I started to speak out about lockdowns that things started to change. So going back over, fast forward now, from this time when literally I could do anything, from giving kids guns and knives and fires and all the rest of it, to 2020, I remember when Boris Johnson said many of us will lose loved ones, and at the time it wasn't clear that COVID was only going to affect the most clinically vulnerable, elderly, etc., etc. It was this indiscriminate virus, and I'd seen these videos and pictures coming out of China of people, now debunked videos, of course, of people falling down dead in the street, or the piles of bodies piling up in Italy, etc. And I just thought, right, I need to close my school because, I've got 365 kids, 60 parents, 60 members of staff. There are probably about 1,000 people who I am responsible for. So the next day I went to school and I sent a message to parents saying, if you would like to keep your child at home until we know what's going on, please do. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And interestingly, at the time, the biggest critics of me now were really critical of me doing that then. And the reason was because we hadn't been given permission to do that. No one in authority had said it's time to close schools or anything like that. So anyway, about 5 days later, there was a national school partial closure, because no schools really closed completely. We had in lockdowns about 150 out of our 365 children on the site, 30 members of staff out of the 60 members of staff, so about 20 people on site all the time. And I was still quite sort of paranoid, and I remember I got my guns from my mate's farm and said to my wife, who was very level-headed, by the way, Sandeep Sitara, her name is, she was sort of saying, I think you're really overreacting. And we've got this big camp van, Fiat Contiki, which I'd filled with pasta and all that kind of survival stuff. And then it was about 3 weeks into the sort of pandemic, and looking at what was happening on the ground, because I was with people and talking to parents who were working in the NHS, the local hospital as well, and realised that nothing was really happening. And then Chris Whitty actually said, children are at extremely low risk of serious illness from COVID, and so is the vast majority of the population. So I thought, right, OK, so we're closing down the economy. That's going to have a catastrophic effect on people generally, and particularly the most vulnerable. And it was as soon as I started to talk about that I noticed there was this sort of kind of prickly atmosphere about it. Go on.
Just to hurry you a little bit because of time, you also took a stance about the vaccination.
Well, that's the key thing. So I then, as soon as the vaccine rollout came out for children, in fact, prior to it, I was already talking to Molly by this point, and kept all of my campaigning aligned with reputable people such as her. And I started to talk about the COVID vaccines for children. I'd always say the same 4 things. 1, children are at extremely low risk of serious illness from COVID. The COVID vaccines pose known very serious risks. There was no medium at the time, and still no long-term safety data for the vaccines, and a child could still catch and spread COVID when vaccinated. Therefore, the risks from the vaccines, in my personal opinion, outweighed any potential benefit. And I received a huge amount of kickback for that. I was, first of all, I discovered later that I was monitored by the Counter Disinformation Unit, and I think that was a key part of what was going on. And Molly's excellent book discusses
Can I
this,
just bring in Nigel at this point? Nigel, I would say what listening to here is a very caring and engaged teacher, educator, with clearly strongly felt connection to the kid. That he has been shut down, cancelled, persecuted, harassed, seems to me indicative of the fundamental problem here. That he's being monitored by a disinformation unit. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the Counter Disinformation Unit should have done what it said on the tin, which was to counter disinformation. What was really important during the early days of COVID is not to actually reduce public confidence with stuff that was just plain wrong. So that's what it was meant to do. What it wasn't meant to do is monitor individuals like mine, and that was overstepping the mark.
Tonya, you've been listening. I can see from your body language how you're reacting. I find Mike to be indicative of something fundamental here, that someone exercising so much sensible respect and care to his children ended up on the wrong end of the establishment.
But all the good people did. Because all the good people were honest, speaking the truth, truly caring about the children. Molly, Mike, me, I used to be a primary school teacher. One of the things that made me go mad about lockdown and what really kind of turned me on is I remember thinking, these kids that I used to teach who are neglected and abused, they're locked in tenements with these people. This can't be right. So anybody who spoke up, spoke the truth, was vilified and has to deal with it. This is why we cannot let it go. This is why we have to get to the bottom of it. Those that told lies have to be brought up in front and be judged.
Mike, where do you go from here?
Right, so can I just add, so I was investigated, I was reported 3 times for expressing my lawful opinion about the COVID vaccines for kids. I was investigated 3 times, cleared across the board 3 times, and on the last occasion I was reported to the Department for Education's Counter-Extremism Division. So I was cast as an extremist. So was Molly.
I'm just running out of time here. Yeah. I'm going to have to go into another break. Thanks so much for all of that. I'm also obligated to say there's a statement from the council, East Sussex County Council. We're aware that Mr Fairclough has made a claim to the Employment Tribunal. The County Council has submitted a defence of the claim, and it would be inappropriate for us to comment further. So that's their contribution to the conversation. But where do you go from here after 20, 30 years of teaching?
So I've been blacklisted from the education sector. I'm also an author of 3 books. Rewilding Childhood was my last one, but I've been blacklisted from the mainstream publishing world as well. So I've just started a Substack. You can Google it, Mike Fairclough Substack. Anyone who's would like to support that would be fantastic. I'm putting a lot of my work is now about how to inspire other people to speak out. So it's not about moaning about the past. How do we empower those who've self-censored out of fear of reprisals to be able to speak about politically sensitive and controversial topics? And I think that's where we need to go.
Hear you loud and clear, Mike. Thank you for joining us tonight.